not here on Friday, and I guess a speakers list was not captured. So as far as who was on that list when you last left off, or we last left off on Friday. So it is the speakers list is open. We are on MP Morantz's sub amendment. I see an eager MP Chambers hand just go up. So we've got MP Chambers on the list, and then anybody else, you let me know as we go along. Okay, then I see MP Davies, then MP Morantz, and we'll, and then MP Zerowitz. So we'll get started with MP Chambers.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you. I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday weekend. We had a great start to the weekend with a committee meeting. That's how I like to start every holiday weekend, Mr. Chair. Now, Mr. Chair, I have sent to the clerk a transcript in English that I'm hoping he will be able to share with our translators. And when I get the thumbs up from the translators that they have it, I will commence. But until then, let's just remind ourselves where we are. There's an amendment.
I'm seeing heads nodding that they do not have it. So
Yeah,
nothing.
I'll wait until I won't enter the transcript until I get a signal from our friends that they have it. But let's do a bit of a recap where we are. A motion to fast track this over 600-page budget bill, which apparently needs to get out of committee by June 3rd, according to the government, but we know that that's not true. There's at least one other week there that we could have committee meetings and witness studies or witness testimony. And we have an amendment to hear from Mr. Mark Carney. Well, thank you very much. And so just to make sure we're on all keeping in relevance, Mr. Carney's been giving some speeches. In fact, one speech was recently reported as the headline saying, Mark Carney says the federal budget not focused enough on growth. Another article from the fall was from the CBC, of all places. Former Bank of Canada Governor Carney questions the carbon price break on home heating oil. Now, Mr. Carney then said he would do something different. I would like to know what that something different is, as I'm sure many Canadians would. And for those members of the Liberal caucus who have already pledged their support to a leadership contestant on an upcoming leadership race to be determined, should also want Mr. Carney to face a reasonable amount of scrutiny. I'll remind committee that it was a member of this committee who retweeted his speech from just a few weeks ago when he talked about the budget and lack of growth. But I also want to take a little bit of time travel here, and we'll go back. I believe this is in 2021. Mr. Mark Carney was on a famous podcast, The Hurly Burly. And I have, Mr. Chair, the transcript of that podcast, which our wonderful translators have. And so we should examine what Mr. Mark Carney has to say about a number of issues. So we'll begin. Greetings, Hurly-Burlyites. We're going to get right to it. It's a two-part pod today, a very exciting two-part pod. It's first up, Mark Carney. Yep, that Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Mark Carney. That Mark Carney who recently spoke at the Liberal Convention. Pause, not in the transcript. Mr. Mark Carney has also spoken at Liberal Party conventions. Very interesting. Okay, back to the transcript. But I have to ask, how much do you really know about this man? Today, we're going to attempt to crack open the Carney. We'll take a deeper dive into his story. Why a young, successful master of the universe guy just quits to become a bureaucrat in the Department of Finance. We'll talk about the thesis of his new book, Values, Building a Better World for All. And we're going to try to demystify the link between climate action and finance policy, what that means for Canada, and maybe we'll talk a little bit of the budget. Part 2 of the pod is not safe for work, NSFW. Let's face it, it may not even be safe for you to listen alongside your goddamn AirPods. That's just me repeating, not trying to use unparliamentary language, but I'll be more careful, Mr. Chair. It's our political panel with Jenny, except no BS Byrne, and Scott. I have no need of fancy grooming products. Read. We'll talk about the continuing Ford fallout in Ontario. Sick leave? What sick leave? The Vance sexual misconduct story. How compelling is this politically? Does it even matter? Trudeau got the guns out in his vaccine photo op, but he's been tardy on travel bans. We'll chat about that. Plus, stick around for our Hey Yous this week. Mark Carney, I want to come and tell you, I want to be on the hurly-burly. So happy to have you here. I've known you well, for I've met you about 20 years ago. I've known you for about 10 years, but you've thought you've never had any times on your hands or been unemployed long enough to come on the show. So thank you for coming. Mark Carney. This is a new low, David. It's a new low. David Hurley. You never thought that. Oh my God, how are you? I'm all right. I'm good. I'm happy to be here. Good to see you. I've listened to you for some time, so it's good to see you. You're looking well. Blurry, if well. Blurry is actually my best look. Yeah, fuzzy. It's an effect I use on camera. A little bit of a pause, yeah? What do you do for fun? You're in Ottawa. What are you doing for fun? Yeah, this city doesn't wake up. Time out. Very true story. The city that fun forgot. Sometimes Ottawa, the only city in the entire country who has to hire a night manager to make the city more fun. Back to the transcript. What am I doing for fun? I mean, it's tough at the best of times. It's difficult. There's not a lot, we've got 2 of our kids here, so we have fun, the sort of family unit. Meal times are fun, something to look forward to. To be honest, look, I'm in a book club. I mean, it's a good man. It's good. We're doing the second loop through, Schitt's Creek and watching a bit of the Oilers. Oh, pause. Also watching the Oilers this year, too. Interesting, a perennial Stanley Cup favorite. Back to the transcript. We're on the fringes like many of us. I'm sleeping in the office sort of thing, and so I spend a lot of time staring into this device for various work stuff. So there's a bit of fun, but yeah, I'm ready to be released when we're released. Pause. Ready to be released when it's time. Maybe now is that time, Mr. Chair. David Hurley, I'm sure. Hey, listen, we've got a lot of Ontario listeners on this podcast, so you tell them who in reality is the best hockey team in Canada right now. Mark Carney, the Edmonton Oilers. I had been interviewed the other day. It was American. It was Bloomberg. I think it was American, yeah. And he said, this is the year the Leafs are going to win the cup. And he went on, and I was like, well, what are you talking about? The Oil's going to win.
Point of order.
Point of order. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, this is riveting. I don't understand the relevance, the hockey, to the importance to this committee. So could you please move along to whatever point it is that you are making or attempting to make today? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, MP Thompson. Yeah. MP Chambers. Just
on
for
that point of order,
relevance,
Mr.
and
Chair.
if you can get
Mr. Chair.
to the substance of what you're trying to
On that point of order.
provide here to the committee. Yeah. On that point of order, MP Morantz.
I think it would be important to mention to Ms. Thompson that she can't give instructions directly to Mr. Chambers. It has to be through the chair.
Okay. That is correct, through the chair. Okay. Thank you, MP Morantz. And back to MP Chambers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I apologize in advance. I didn't write the transcript. This is the transcript of a podcast interview that Mr. Carney gave with the famous Liberal strategist David Hurley. So if we want to learn a little bit more about Mark Carney, which is the subject of the sub-amendment, this is the opportunity to do so. But because I'm feeling somewhat generous, we'll skip a little bit of the hockey intro for Ms. Thompson. So we'll get into Mark Carney partway down second page. where David Hurley says sports scholarship or academic scholarship. He's talking about where he went to university. Mark Carney, I went to Harvard, and they don't have financial aid. So you get in or you don't, and if it helps you to do other things getting in, but once you're in, then they just calculate based on your financial needs. So I had financial aid. So it wasn't a scholarship per se, but some grants, some loan, and some from the Alberta government. So the Nobel Scholarship, I was a Nobel Scholar. How's that like to you to refer to me as that for the rest of the pod? Nobel Scholar. David Hurley laughing. Nobel Scholar, yeah, I'm writing that. Mark Carney, I'm writing for the Alberta Heritage Fund, so I owe one of the many things I owe to Alberta. And Peter Lougheed, yes, absolutely. So there's something inexplicable about you to me, and you need to explain it to me. And that is, you're in New York City. You're a master of the universe. You're making scads of money. You're living the glamorous life. This is the Go USA of Bill Clinton and Bob Rubin in the 1990s, and you're at Goldman. And you quit to come back to be an official in the Department of Finance. Not a junior official, but not the boss either. Just an official in the Department of Finance. Why did you do that? Mark Carney. Well, I've always been interested in public policy. I came from, background. My father was an academic, principally an academic, but he was a deputy minister for a time in the Alberta government during the Lougheed years. Al Boomer Adair was his minister, both in Northern Affairs and Parks and Recreation, not the SIPCON, but the very serious department in Alberta. And so I'd always be interested. I had done undergrad. I worked for a few years in London and Tokyo. Then I went back and did graduate work in economics. And my intention was to go into something like public policy relatively quickly as things happened. I went to Goldman, got a great assignment working with the ANC, which is the African National Congress, just as Nelson Mandela was coming into government. And we advised them, and so I came and did that. Anyways, blah, 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 it took 10 or more years before I executed coming into public policy. And I actually came in initially with the Bank of Canada. David, I saw an ad in the paper for a deputy governor, and I thought, wait, it was my last chance, and here's the chance. And if I'm really serious about doing it, I should try it. And David Dodge took a chance on me. And the rest, one thing leads to another, and after that. And I loved every minute of it. Interesting, okay. So you have in the later years thrown yourself into the climate change file, and you talk a lot about climate change. A big butt chunk of your book is about climate change. You're involved in a number of initiatives. But I recall from years past talking to you that you weren't always focused on this issue as you are now. Did you have, I don't want to necessarily use Chrystia Freeland's words, but did you have an epiphany of sorts on this, and what was it? No. Look, there's lots of issues, and I worked on this issue as a civil servant, particularly when Ralph Goodall was finance minister. There was a climate plan somehow, but then, obviously when I was governor of the Bank of Canada, we had the financial crisis and the core work there. Really what it came to a head once when I was the governor of the Bank of England. One of the many things you're responsible for as the Bank of England is you oversee the insurance industry. And that means it's the fourth largest insurance industry in the world. And it includes Lloyd's of London, which is this incredible, 300 or 3-century plus old institution that does things like insure hockey players' knees, which they do. But they also one of the biggest insurers of property in the Gulf of Mexico, and their biggest risk is basically climate change. So they have to absolutely be on top of it. And extreme weather events had tripled in the last few decades. The cost had gone up 5 times, so huge, hundreds of billions of dollars. And that's actually just insured cost. And that's actually just the insured cost is much bigger costs that aren't insured. It's very obvious that I knew it was happening, but the scale of it was happening at the speed which it was changing becomes present. Then in parallel, this is about 6 years ago, I guess, I'm overseeing the all-time financial reforms post-crisis, something called the Financial Stability Board. So the global reforms for that, and I was asked by G20 leaders, what's the role of finance, the financial sector, in dealing with climate change? And so the response was, well, there's an issue here, which is, and I termed it, there's a tragedy on the horizon, which is by the time it's clear and present danger for everybody in the financial sector, not just Lloyd's of London and big insurance industry, it's going to be too late to meet climate goals. It's going to be too late to keep temperatures below 2 degrees. And you need to think about your leaders with the financial sectors. Just not going to front run politics and policy. You have to grab this and pull it forward. Pull it forward, and that will lead to a series of reforms and measures, including, I won't bore you with them in here, but very important plumbing reforms that are now absolutely mainstream. At the time, it was viewed as, there was a wide range of opinion on that. But I think, it would have been good if, well, not if, but if we had done that 10 years ago previously. I wasn't in a role to do that, and I wouldn't have seen it. But all of that is now, it's becoming mainstream, and we're working on the next phase of addressing it. What are your conversations about climate change? What are your conversations about climate change go like with your friends from Alberta? I think he meant, how do your conversations about climate change go with your friends from Alberta? Mark Carney. They've moved over time, I think the recognition, I've never had a conversation with people in Alberta about the issue or whether or not it was happening. There's a range of opinions, but the speed with which it was happening, but what the contribution could be from Alberta or Canada to be part of the solutions and the responsibilities of others are, how serious or how seriously the world was taking it. I think what's happened in terms of the financial sector and the central, this is now viewed in terms of investment and lending of major financial participants all over the world, we just signed up $70 trillion. I'm going to repeat that. American dollars, for net zero plans from across the financial sector. And that number is going to grow between now and in Glasgow. So I think we're a bit slow to recognize that was coming. And it's been clear for a while. It was coming. It's probably coming a little sooner than I would have even expected it. But I did expect that we would end up here someday. So what does that mean? That those with $70 trillion have signed up to a set of targets and protocols that they mean really they can't invest in oil sands anymore? Well, this is not that per se. So what they've signed on to is very important. They've signed up for, I'm going to go for from easy to hard, okay? So the easy bit is a country or an energy company or bank says, I'll be net zero by 2050, right? That's not quite far. It's not easy to get there, by the way, and it's not sort of easy to make that commitment. And of course, the more reputable you are, if you make the commitment, you intend to pull it back and say, well, where are you going to be in 2030? Now, 2030, it sounds like a long time, but it's not a long time. When you think about an energy company or an auto company, for an auto company, that's like 1 or 2 models, right? And I think all that R&D and development and plant design you have to do, particularly if you're switching from internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle. So we see it. And so you think about changing the portfolio, the generation mix of utility is substantially reducing the carbon footprint of the oil sands, or getting up and running in scale, real scale, not just of pilot projects, carbon capture and storage, which is what we need for the oil sands. Pause. Mark Carney seems to be a very big fan of carbon capture and storage. I'm sure my friends in the NDP would like to question him on that kind of commitment. But we'll go back to the transcript. So, the carbon footprint of the oil sands are getting up and running in scale, real scale, not just of pilot projects of carbon capture and storage, which is what we need for the oil sands, which is what we need for the hydrogen economy. Natural gas 9 years from now. It's not tomorrow, but it's, the day after tomorrow in terms of what needs to be done. So the key for these, and so looking back to what you were asking for the financial institutions, is $70 trillion. One of the things we've been trying to do is say, okay, so you have to say you're going to be where you have to be in 2030. All right. So what proportion of the 50% reduction that the world needs to be on track in order to get to net zero by 2050? I'm not going to explain the math if you want, but that's basically what's required. And then what you're doing in the next 5 years. What's your decarbonization for the next 5 years? Your plan. How are you going to do it by various industries? The thing, though, with which we're trying to get in and we're trying to be succeeding is decarbonization. So if there's a company, and I won't name specific ones, but a company out in the oil patch the energy patch in Alberta, who's going to make a big investment, or consortia of big investments that are going to pull carbon out of the process and decarbonize, then we want banks, investors to put their money behind that. And when they put their money behind it, the actual portfolio, I'm realizing where most people will be listening to this, not watching it. So my very dear clear hand movements are only for your benefit. But the carbon in the portfolio of the bank or the investor will go up, and we're designing a system so that there's a credit for the fact that the investment will initially lead to lower carbon 5 years out or 10 years out. And that's absolutely critical. And that's, so you know, Carville said it's the economy stupid, where it's just the transition stupid. It's not just jumping overnight to green future. It'd be nice if we could do, you know, but we can't just do that. And you need to get the money behind it. So look, it means, but what does it mean for any company in the world increasingly is, if you're a major emitter, what's your plan? What's your plan to get emissions down? What kind of investments do you intend to make? What's your pathway to get there? And if you're part of the solution, you're going to get capital thrown at you. If you're part of the problem, if you're slow, it's becoming very expensive and difficult to raise money. And so, but the former is definitely the case. That's the other side of the 70 trillion. This money needs to be put to work. We'll leave from the transcript for a second. So Mr. Carney saying we need $70 trillion to decarbonize is suggesting that companies that don't have a plan will face higher costs of capital, which we've already seen happening. You know, the investors in the market have been demanding that companies disclose their climate goals. But what's interesting is regulators like OSFI, who've come here in this committee and bragged about the fact that about 3 or 4 years ago, they had 3 or 4 people working on climate change division. Now OSFI has 30 people working on a climate change division, and OSFI is now threatening financial institutions to increase the capital requirements for lenders who lend to oil and gas. It seems to me that's a bit of a stretch for OSFI's mandate. I didn't recall any debate in Parliament about changing OSFI mandate to include such a strong focus on climate change. But perhaps Mr. Carney has a view on whether he supports the regulator taking an approach like that. Especially, is the regulator now going to start evaluating all these plans? Are the regulators going to start analyzing all of the climate change emissions reductions plans of all these? Or should they just let investors in the market decide what they will demand from that company? I'd love to ask OSFI that question, but they haven't been here in almost a year. Wonder if they're trying to avoid us, Mr. Chair. So we'll go back to the transcript. David Hurley. I spent the first decade of my life as a farm boy in rural Saskatchewan. So here's an innovation I'd never thought I'd see. The most important piece of equipment in farming today isn't a tractor or combine or a plow. It's the smartphone the farmer holds in their hand. Yep, new technologies like AI, robotics, big data, and network connectivity have changed the way we farm better. Mr. Chair, I apologize. This is just an advertisement in the podcast. I'm going to skip this section for Ms. Thompson's sake. I know that we don't need to give any free advertising to anyone here at Finance Committee. Okay, back to David Hurley. So, into submission here. No, you have not. You're doing a lot of work with the UN. What's that like? Like, I have a pretty jaundiced view, but I only follow the Security Council. What's it like to work with the UN? Mark Carney, you follow the Security Council? Well done. That's good, yeah. It's like, what's it like with the UN? Well, look, what I do is I spend half my time on this at least. I'm a special envoy, so another Nobel scholar and special envoy. If you could use both of those from now on. Yeah, for the Secretary General and private on climate finance. So what are you talking about? So the private sector for finance and climate, and how to organize the financial system and get them behind being part of the solution for climate change. Getting money to that getting money to that example we just talked about, the company in Alberta that's going to reduce its carbon footprint. Okay. Or a new renewable or new technology and all that, but organizing the whole system. And I'm also Prime Minister Boris Johnson's advisor on exactly the same issue. Time out from the transcript. So Mr. Carney's also advised Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So Boris Johnson obviously had a lot of faith in Governor Carney. Wonder what Governor Carney thinks of Mr. Johnson's record, especially with respect to Brexit. We know that Mr. Carney was very against Brexit, and Boris Johnson wanted to bake the Brexit pie. But that would be an interesting discussion to have with Mr. Carney as well at this committee. Back to the transcript. And all of this is coming together for this COP meeting, COP26 in Glasgow, which is the big climate meeting this November in Glasgow, which is why Canada, why you had the Biden summit, why you had Canada's new target, why we'll just be here, they're rolling on that. So look, we've got a team of about 30 people based in London, third private sector, third from Bank of England, third from the Treasury, the UK Treasury. And what we do is we're organizing a whole work plan to get the plumbing in place in the financial sector to deal with this issue and get private institutions, which I think the 70 trillion number gives you a sense of the scale lined up to be part of the solution. There's probably, I've lost count, but there's probably about 1,000 people in the private sector who are working on various working groups on setting new carbon markets, dealing with people like the World Bank so they're more effective, and on and on and on. So I don't, to be honest, I'm not involved in the UN joys of the UN bureaucracy, or, obviously I don't deal with the Secretary General, who's the Deputy Secretary. I deal with the Secretary General and Amina Mohammed, who is the Deputy Secretary General, who is outstanding. And, literally when you're talking to these people, they're coming out of a discussion or about to go into the discussion of some horrible, global issue, challenge from the pandemic, through to, some of the most difficult hotspots in the world. So they have my admiration, but it would be a tough place to work there, that's for sure. I should pause here for a moment, Mr. Chair. Mr. Carney had initially arranged a number of financial institutions that signed up to support the push for net zero and to dedicate a certain amount of funds. A number of those initial signatories have now withdrawn their support. So that's another interesting point of discussion we should have with Mr. Carney. Why did some of these large financial institutions who initially were very enthusiastic about his project have since stepped away? In addition, companies like S&P 500, or excuse me, Standard & Poor's, are no longer reviewing ESG ratings. They're not providing ESG ratings anymore for companies. Why? Because they're meaningless. ESG is a more of a marketing scam than it is anything substantive. And this notion that you could, the way that the E, the S, and the G interplay together, environmental, sustainable, and governance interplay together, this notion that a company could do something really badly in one of those areas, environmental, sustainable, or governance, but could be saved by stellar performance in another one of those areas is a bit bizarre. For example, should a company who is a awful polluter be given a free pass because it has a gender balanced board? I don't know, but this is the kinds of discussions that people have when they give ESG ratings. And that's why Standard & Poor's have stopped doing it, because the whole thing is a scam. Let's go back to the transcript. David Hurley, so you got a book out? Yeah, I've got a book here. Here it is, yes. You got a book out, here it is. Can I see the sign? Well, we'll skip a little bit ahead here. David Hurley, some people say they struggled with finishing it, but they just don't like big words, those people. I found the book exciting because it contains the seeds of a different governing philosophy and an intellectual break with Reagan and Thatcher, in my view. What's the thesis? If you could just take our listeners and viewers through it, what's the basic thesis of the book? Mark Carney. Yeah, well, I'll maybe say a word on the genesis and then I'll get to the thesis, which is, as you mentioned, I said I was a central bank governor, G7 governor. I started just on the eve of the global financial crisis. I literally handed over the keys to the Bank of England in the middle of March last year. So just as the UK was locking down and, we were launching in the first phases of the response to the COVID crisis. And in between, you had the Euro crisis, we had Brexit, we had the mounting climate crisis. So it was basically a governor through a series of crises. And what I wanted to do is step back and think, okay, is there a common driver of this? And what is there? And I did feel that really both in looking back over the sweep of economic thought and experience of these crises, that we had lost balance between some of the core values that are necessary first for the market to function well. So, I'm a big believer in markets, and I'm a big believer in markets that can serve a role in solving our biggest problems. But markets don't exist in a vacuum. Markets are social conventions in the end. And markets are social conventions in the end. Sorry, the big words there, but social conventions. And they have, you need fairness. You need a sense of fairness and responsibility. You need resilience to markets. You can't just have markets just crumble as they did with subprime crisis. So you need those elements. You need markets, or markets also, that are largely short-term or can be short-term. We are, as individuals, short-term. So we have this tragedy on the horizon with respect to climate. So how do we bring in elements of sustainability? How do we bring in elements of solidarity? In other words, regional solidarity in Canada, solidarity with others in societies, leaning against the forces of inequality. And how do we marry all of these with the power of markets, what I call dynamism of markets, which is going to lead the innovation and growth and better jobs, etc. And so how do we bring that back to balance? And so the thesis is that the pendulum, and it's on more dimensions than just two, has become unbalanced. And it walks through a number of examples. It really starts from a place where actually how economics views value. Up until the 19th century, it was viewed as either something intrinsic to the good or the activity, or a reflection of the labor and the work that had been put into that activity. That's what Adam Smith thought. That's what David Ricardo thought happened, also to be what Marx thought. And it gets flipped around in the 19th century. And the end of the 19th century, and intensified over the course of the last several decades, where the value of something is its price and only its price. And if something isn't priced, it does not have value. That's the way things have become treated. So, I use this example on climate, which we know precisely the value of Amazon. The company, 1.7, $1 trillion, Amazon. The region has no value until you actually start burning the forest and convert it into farmland. Well, that doesn't really make sense. We have a tendency, and that is a little less in Canada, but you see it in the UK, in the US, and other places where we're paying for charity and bringing charitable or volunteer acts, blood donation, and other charitable acts into the market. And what happens is that changes people's behavior. It corrodes the math underlying back. Okay, so that's a set of issues. I'm not explaining in purely linear form. You got to read the book, but it goes on like that. And what I try to do, and part of the reason that the book is longer, is okay. So because it's frustrating when you get to these sort of elaborate analysis of the problem without any suggestive solution. And so what the book does is look at these three crises: climate, COVID, and credit. Credit being the financial crisis, and say, okay, what are some of the responses to that? And what are the lessons? And what does that mean? If you're a leader of an organization, if you're a company or a country, how are the types of things that you should do to reinforce these broader set of values: fairness, responsibility, solidarity, sustainability, alongside dynamism? And I do make a point that this is the sincere point. Do you expect that I would have figured it out earlier after 30 years? It finally came to me. Humility being the value, the most important value. And it's important, humility's a very important value. Like it not, but not humility that's incapacitated. You've got to marry ambition and humility in a way that's effective, and I try to draw that out. So David Hurley says, I'll pass this along to Scott Reed. So when you're reading the book, you're describing this. My mind is turning to my nostalgic view of the 1960s, when the difference between CEOs the difference between what their CEOs made and their workers was much smaller than it is now, where rich people got taxed at high rates, where people got good union jobs, they had a life with benefits, and business leaders cared about. They lived in communities in which their businesses operated and cared about the communities in which the business operated. That may all be rose-colored nostalgia, but that's what I'm thinking about. But I don't hear anybody calling for us to return to the 1960s. I think, well, first thing, there's always a danger of picking a point in time. There's, this sort of seded, right? You had this time of nostalgia for a time that never was, or an interpretation of a time that never was. But there are elements, and I'm not saying this is a call for back to the 60s in any way, shape, or form. In fact, one of the core points of the book, and I think one of the key challenges we serve as a country, the others share it, is how do we take the technologies and opportunities that risks and opportunities come with them and build, a more balanced system. And the book is building a better world for all. And a lot can be done through greater connectivity in a way that builds, the regional economy in Canada. And that helps our small businesses, take on the real world through platforms and others. But let me loop back to your core question. I think one of the issues I spend a fair bit of time in the book is around corporate purpose and the nature of the company. So I am not a Friedmanite. I think that I should be clear. I think Friedman in part he did some brilliant guy and did some great work, made some good points in a variety of ways. But his fundamental shareholder primacy is fundamentally wrong and fundamentally, in my view, flawed because he gives himself an out. In fact, the only purpose of business is making profit for shareholders. And he says, subject to the ethical customs of the time, the ethics and customs of the age. So subject to, and he assumes that those are unchanged by emphasis solely on profit. And in fact, he says any activity, he literally says in a famous essay, any activity that is support for the community or support for the workers is hypocritical window dressing, which if it serves a purpose of quote unquote hypocritical window dressing, it serves the purposes of enticing people and are pulling the wool over people's eyes, then that's okay. But it really is ultimately just for that goal, and that's wrong. That's just wrong for two reasons. One, there's a corrosion of cure at the purest market fundamentalism, and the book goes through it. Doesn't matter, it's in the book. You'll see it in the financial markets. You see that I lived it in the run-up and had to deal with it as a public official in the run-up to the crisis. And afterwards, you see it in the social strains that we have because of these greater extremes that we have built up between, whether it's CEO compensation or those on the shop floor, how we pay our essential workers, not for what we need them in essential times, but only for normal times. Still there. And so you see it. I think there's a real economic issue, which you don't see. If you don't have a sense of purpose and a sense of alignment you can get from a company. In other words, you're solving an issue. Shopify has a sense of purpose. Its purpose is mass entrepreneurialism. And its purpose is to make, it easier to start a business and sell anywhere. And that animating purpose actually helps those who supply Shopify, those who go on it. It organizes the community. It has a knock-on effect, which actually is itself fulfilling. It's good for Shopify itself, but it's good for shareholders, the employees, and very importantly, the customers, clients, and the businesses that are there. So that world, a world where you have a company with any sense of purpose, we have to have that solidarity within a company, with its community, and within the company. I think there's a rebalancing towards that. I think if I can bring it up to a level in the country's objectives, we're going through two huge rewirings in the economy, right? We're at the cusp. We're still early in the digital rewiring of the economy. It's been accelerated by COVID, and there's a lot more to come. I say in the book, are we going to be digital by default? Are we just going to let this happen on the way that technology companies determine is best? Or are we going to be digital by design? Are we going to design policies? Are we going to get help and people build the skills? Are we going to organize things so that many Canadians can benefit as possible from it? And you can see that that can happen. I go through the book on climate and sustainability. We're getting to a point, and this is a key point, opportunity for us to see a challenge. I think it's an opportunity where we have to move to. We're going to deal with climate. We've got 130 countries now joined by the U.S. to say we're going to get net zero. We've got 1,500 of the world's largest companies who say net zero. We've got $70 trillion as of last week saying we're going to go net zero. So there's an animating purpose. An objective that changes the equation is because that means that lots of smart people, lots of driven people, lots of inquisitive people around the world are going to be figuring out how we best get to net zero. And they will get there in a way as, effective, cheaper, quicker than a government would. And that's to go back to the title of the book, which is values. The parentheses around the S. That's how you get value in the market serving the values of society. I'm just a little unclear how you break the stranglehold on shareholders and corporate behavior because, I'm not an ethical investor. I direct my investments to where I can get the greatest return. We're repeatedly told that we all rail against corporate malfeasance, that our pension funds are all invested in those. And if we wanted our pension funds to invest ethically, we'd have to settle for less in retirement. I know I work with a lot of CEOs that would like to be doing their jobs differently, but they got to report to these shareholders on a quarterly basis. And if the shareholders don't think they're doing everything they can to drive up the share price, then they get, the CEO will be replaced. So, it may not be the corporation that shouldn't run only for the benefit of shareholders, but shareholders have a choke on them, don't they? Well, I think the first thing, and there's a variety of premises in that question that are wrong. And I'll accept that. I'll grant you that if you don't invest ethically, like the records show that. But the first is that there is a trade-off. The evidence is very strong. I'm someone who's been in and around financial markets for 3 decades, then the private side or the public side. So I know something about this, and it goes through this in some detail. The alignment and correlation between broader ESG and broader ESG. And I won't give you all the details like the number of item in the book, including the footnotes, but it's about 60% of the analysis. Find a positive correlation between companies that score more highly on weighing ethical, social, and government they score more highly, positive correlation between companies that score and weighing ethical, social, and government and sustainable and so on. Why is that the case? First, there's a series that you're avoiding. In many cases, what you're doing is you're screening out a problem. You're screening out Volkswagen or a company that's going to do something bad and eventually going to be caught up in it. Sorry, Volkswagen. Yeah, that's a good example. It's a good example. Actually, we should pause there. Volkswagen, the company who was busted and fined significant sums for misleading the entire planet, is a massive recipient of corporate welfare to build a battery plant in Ontario. So the Canadian government is giving tons of taxpayer money to a company who purposely misled every buyer of their products. And we're supposed to just accept that that's the price of getting production here.
Point of order, Chair. I just wanted to, it's actually more a point of clarification just for Mr. Chambers. I'm just giving him a chance to take a breath and have a drink of water because I'm so kind. But I also just wanted to see if he was still quoting from the transcript that he was reading for the last, how long has it been now? I guess it hasn't been that long
48
yet.
minutes. Yeah.
How many minutes?
48.
48 minutes, yeah. Whether he's still quoting directly from that, because it sounded like he moved into opinion. I'd just like to be clear on what his opinion is versus what the transcript he's reading is.
Thank you.
Just so we're all aware.
Okay, thanks, P.S. Turnbull. I don't know if MP Chambers would like to answer that or not. I do have a speakers list after MP Chambers. When MP Chambers concludes, that goes MP Davies, MP Morantz, and MP Zerowitz, and continues to grow.
Could you add me to the list too?
Okay, MP Lawrence.
Thank you.
You? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, actually, when we got to the Volkswagen part, the Volkswagen comments were from Mr. Carney, but the other subsequent follow-up comments on Volkswagen about the government subsidizing a company that's misled the world, those are editorial comments for sure. Let's make no mistake. But it would be good to ask Mr. Carney whether he thinks the auto subsidies are appropriate, especially as Mr. Carney has experience working in the Department of Finance and during the financial crisis during 2008, 2009, when the government, the then government, bailed out General Motors and Chrysler for substantial sums. But I would point out, Mr. Chair, when those bailouts were provided, the governments, including the U.S. government, but more importantly, the Canadian government, received equity in, we'll just use General Motors as an example. So for the bailout, the Canadian taxpayer received equity, as in shares, in General Motors, which was then able to be sold to recoup some of the initial bailout. This government has provided, I think I've lost count, 40 some odd billion dollars to subsidize electric vehicle battery plants. You could buy the entire Ford Motor Company for half of that. The government could have actually just purchased an entire car company for half of the amount of money that it's providing in subsidy and corporate welfare for the auto sector, for which we don't even get any equity, and a promise of some jobs, but there's no upside for the actual taxpayer other than those people who live and might actually have employment. Set aside the fact the government just gave $1.7 million for pasta.
Point of order. I hate to correct my colleague, but aren't quite a few of those workers foreign temporary workers, not Canadian?
Indeed, Mr. Lawrence is correct. So some of those workers that we're subsidizing are coming in with their expertise, are temporary foreign workers, and hopefully, I hope the idea is that they'll pass their expertise on to Canadian workers and members of our unions. But what's interesting is the government has decided to play the game where they're going to subsidize everything to come. A few years ago, we were told, or we've been told for at least a generation, that compared to the U.S., Canada stands out for a few reasons. One, favorable exchange rate. Two, healthcare costs that are largely borne by government. Three, well-trained workforce. Apparently, none of those things actually matter. What we have to do is now meet the U.S. dollar for dollar on the subsidies that they're going to provide. And if we want to go down the same fiscal path of the U.S., I suppose that's the way the government would like to go. But I think it's very concerning. We don't have the same amount of money that the U.S. does. We don't have the world's reserve currency. We are going to see the challenges that this government's spending and subsidization is going to have on the economy when our dollar goes down, when our balance of payments gets significantly out of whack because we're not allowing investments in productive areas of the economy. The government has a clear path, which is we will subsidize to make it happen. The other interesting point is the government says, "Oh well, look at these new data points. Foreign direct investment is going up." Well, the only reason there's foreign direct investment is the government's actually subsidizing the investment that's coming here. That's not realistic, and it's not practical. Heck, at this recent announcement last week with Honda, the person at Honda said Canada was their third choice. They looked at a couple other countries before they came here. And why did they come here? Because the government gave them tons of money. Like, of course they're going to come here. But natural gas has no business case. Notwithstanding the fact that multiple countries' representatives and leaders have come here and asked for it, but we're to believe that natural gas has no business case. But some of these investments that the government's making, the only business case exists is because there's a subsidy. So I have a hard time following that. But I appreciate the intervention from my colleague to remind everyone that those workers initially at these battery plants will be temporary foreign workers. So, Mr. Chair, I'm going to pause here for a moment. But before I pass on the floor, we could have, and I will come back to the transcript because there is some good stuff in here, which I think is, in fact, even more relevant to what we'll be discussing. But we were in the middle of witness testimony, hearing from officials on the budget. The government decided to put a very aggressive timeline on the budget to get it reported back to the House. We do this every single spring. The government could have brought its motion to have a certain number of witness testimony, a certain number of hours. We could have agreed upon that. Could have ensured that the NDP was satisfied with the number of witness testimony. And then could have deferred the decision about when to start clause by clause to any time. Could have been dealing with it in a week from now. Could have been dealing with it in 2 weeks from now. And could have brought a motion just on when they wanted to start clause by clause at any time and not taking witness time away. But I suspect we'll end up in the same place as we were last year, where we'll run the clock all the way down to the end, have a rush set of witnesses, or maybe not. Maybe this time it will require a House instruction, because what we've been doing is not an effective way to be looking at bills. I appreciated the fact that with C-59 we had a certain amount of witness testimony, which was negotiated with the former finance critic of the NDP. That was reasonable. But we could have the same here if we just agreed to defer the decision on the clause-by-clause start date for a couple weeks or even just a couple meetings. So it's unfortunate that we may be here tonight until midnight. As I understand, there's resources. I'll have to find another podcast with Mr. Carney to revel you all with. But it's pretty clear that Mr. Carney is looking to enter the political arena. So I think we should give him the opportunity. He's been to this committee before. He's always held himself very well. He's capable on a number of fronts, a dynamic individual who has already appeared at the Senate committee last week. He's appeared at the Finance committee a couple of years ago. He's going on podcasts. He's giving speeches. Those Liberal caucus members who are supporting other candidates should want Mr. Carney to face a certain level of scrutiny, because it's not fair that members of cabinet that are also running have to stand up in the House of Commons and receive questions every day from opposition members, or they have to show up at a committee to be grilled. Those leadership contestants are facing a level of scrutiny. What Mr. Carney's been able to do is basically enter the political arena with very little scrutiny, and so we'd like to provide him the opportunity to give his plan for Canadians and where he demarcates from the current government, as he's been talking about in a few of these examples. The budget not focused enough on growth. By the way, back in this podcast, which I didn't get to yet, but we will later, he talks about how it's going to be a couple years before we see the benefits of the government's budget. Well, I wonder if he thinks that those benefits have come true. Doesn't look like it by his recent comments. 3 years ago, he said, we need to wait and see. And 3 years have gone by, and I don't think he's as happy. So, look, I quite like Mr. Carney. I think I think we all learned something. It's not very often you have an opportunity to talk to somebody who's been the governor of the Bank of England, the governor of the Bank of Canada, the senior associate deputy minister in finance, someone who was in the financial sector for 30 years, and someone who's obviously thought a lot about public policy, has written a book about it, and is now interested in contributing. I give him an immense amount of credit for wanting to think about how he can contribute to the country. But I also think it's just reasonable to say, hey, well, why don't you come in and talk about it? I'd also say those of you who are very upset with and hold dearly central bank independence should ask what's been done more to erode the independence of the central bank. The fact that in the U.S. the former Fed chair is now the Secretary of the Treasury, and in Canada you have a former governor of the Bank of Canada who wants to run for political party and has been at least very open about the fact that of which political party that they belong to. I would submit that actually has a lot to do with eroding independence of the central bank. Oh, and by the way, just a couple weeks ago, the Prime Minister said that interest rates would come down, which I found very surprising. I know my colleague, Mr. Lawrence, will likely have something to say on that later. But there's a newsflash. The central bank isn't really that independent anyway. You look at how much communication goes back and forth between the Department of Finance and the central bank on a regular basis. The government picks who leads it. The government at any time can send a letter or instructions to the central bank in writing on issues with respect to monetary policy. For example, back in 2013, there was this discussion about quantitative easing, and Jim Flaherty took some criticism for saying that Canada would not do quantitative easing. Well, guess what? Quantitative easing is the reason why we have inflation today. There are a number of people now who have been questioning the use of quantitative easing. It was well within the finance minister's comments then, as he's able to write letter or instructions to the central bank. But those individuals who thought that quantitative easing had no consequences for 10 years are now all basically backpedaling. And by the way, mixed monetary theory, or modern monetary theory, the fact that you could just print money with no consequences, those people are very quiet on Twitter these days because it's created a significant amount of inflation. And I think someone like Mr. Carney would have a lot to say about the intersection between monetary policy and fiscal policy. I think I also would love to ask the current central bank governor how he would feel if a former central bank governor was the prime minister. I wonder how those conversations would go. But I think it would be a wonderful opportunity to hear from Mr. Carney. As I said, I hold him in very high regard, and I think we should want the opportunity to hear from someone with a resume like his and a desire like his to make the country better. I'd like to give him the platform to do that, Mr. Chair, and that's why I hope that my colleagues will at least agree to the sub-amendment or a version of the sub-amendment that would see Mr. Carney here appear as a witness, as he has previously done before. And quickly before I pass the floor to the next speaker, we still haven't dealt with this money laundering motion yet. I see that there's 4 meetings in the main motion for money laundering. The last review of the Proceeds of Crime and Money Laundering Act was 14 meetings, I think. It's inadequate. And the government, who claims it's doing so much on money laundering, hasn't even kept its statutory obligation to review the act. The government has been doing amendments to money laundering on a piecemeal basis, claiming that every time they make one little change, that is the biggest change, big monumental change. But how about actually just completing the systemic review of the act to fulfill our obligation? They're doing the exact same thing with money laundering that they're doing with competition. Every 6 months, they come out with some new changes to the Competition Act and then say that these are the most monumental changes that have ever been seen to the Competition Act, and now they're doing the same thing with money laundering. Are they making progress? Yes. Is it piecemeal? Yes. Is it inadequate? Yes, because they're not looking at the whole system. So I hope we can get through this motion. I don't also support the few meetings. I think we need to have much more meetings on money laundering. And I hope that Mr. Carney will come and give us some ideas about how we can organize ourselves and our government better for the purpose of Canadians. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MP Chambers, and I'll go to the list again. Next is MP Davies, and then I've got MP Morantz, MP Zerowitz, and MP Lawrence.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's deja vu all over again.
Point of order. I believe the vote going on.
Did the bells go? Yeah, we're just checking if it's the bells. Yeah, it is the bells. It is the bells. Okay, so members, as we do, I'll ask the committee if we have UC
No.
to continue.
No.
I heard a no, so we do not have UC. So we're suspended until after the vote.